Network, a movement of organisations who come together every month to talk about interesting examples of innovative public service practices. We host events like these every month, so please do come along again if you haven't been before. Just want to thank our 4 partners who generously support these events and make them possible. Those organisations are SIPFA, the WEA, Read in Partnership, and the Institute of Employability Professionals. Remembered all the names. I'm delighted that we can bring together a packed room and 3 brilliant guest speakers. We're going to be running till 6:30 p.m. tonight, so we can have a good amount of time for discussion and a good amount of time for Q&A. I also want to thank you for all coming at what is a very busy time here in Westminster. It's Manifesto Week. And it's a nice time to be thinking about the future of the country. It's also kind of tempting to, spend our time poring over the manifestos, listening closely to every long form interview, perhaps watching the TV debates later tonight. I'm going to propose we take our eyes away from the Twitter screen, the TV, the soundbite, and talk about something that's already happened on the ground. And we're going to be looking at how change has already been realised. I think that's the inspiration the country needs. And that's why I'm so delighted that Demos is launching a new essay tonight called Only We Can Save the State. In this essay, Chris, who I will introduce shortly, sets out his personal learnings from his time as a former chief executive at Barking and Dagenham Council. Should stress, for the avoidance of doubt, that this is an independent report from Chris and it's not been written in partnership with Barking and Dagenham Council. I'm delighted that Chris is here tonight to launch his essay, and I'm delighted we've got 2 brilliant guest speakers. So Chris is a director at Inner Circle Consulting. He's also a trustee of the Design Council and has been a massive source of personal inspiration since we first kind of met a couple of years ago. And I want to thank you for everything you've done to further our work here at Demos. To Chris's left, we've got Professor Mark Steers. Mark is the director of the UCL Policy Lab, which do an amazing array of things, particularly on developing work around the respect agenda, which I'm sure we will hear more about tonight. Mark's also the author of England, 7 Myths That Changed a Country with Tom Baldwin, and Out of the Ordinary, How Everyday Life Inspired a Nation and How It Can Again. To Mark's left, we have Professor Abby Innes. Abby is an associate professor of political economy at the London School of Economics. Her latest book, Late Soviet Britain, Why Materialist Utopias Fail, what a title, provides what I think is a marvelously novel and provocative take on where we are and how we might emerge from our current crisis. So that's enough from me. We're going to hand over to Chris, and then we'll have responses from Mark and Abby, and then we'll bring you guys in as well. So over to you, Chris.
Thank you. Let's take this. Feels like there needs to be a key change now for you to stand up, but I'm going to stand up if that's okay. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm afraid I've got to that point in my life where I either have my glasses on and can see the people at the back of the room, but I can't read my notes. Anyway, so if at any point during I'm going to say I'm not going to have my glasses on, right, so I can read my notes. But if at any point you're all kind of glaring at me in the way that normally sort of demonstrates you're not happy with what I'm saying, it's not that I'm sort of grotesquely unself-aware. I just can't see you. Okay, so that's what's happening. So let me start by saying this. First of all, thank you, Ben, for the opportunity to tell this story. And it does feel timely. So before we start, I just want you all to imagine for a moment that it is the spring of 1945, okay? And we're all having a look at the Labour Party's prospectus for the election in July of that year. The context, of course, is war in Europe, uncertain times on the international stage, a resurgent Russia, 15 years on from a terrible financial crash, decimated public finances, and a nation that is crying out for change after all the hardship that they've been through in recent years. Now imagine for a moment that that manifesto does not set out radical structural reform of big institutions of the state to create the NHS, social security, education, major housing provision, but instead promises, incremental pragmatism. And I'm saying all of that because, in my view, the challenges that we face in 2024 are as acute, if not more challenging than they were. They're certainly more complex, I think, than they were in 1945. And to some extent, they are almost so big that we can't see them. And that both politically and professionally, our inclination is to try and make them as small as possible so that we can digest them and form a plan in relation to them. But in so doing, we kind of miss the kind of size of where we are. And look, I'm not naive. I do kind of get the kind of Ming Vase dilemma that Labour are facing right now. But it is also true, is it not, that almost every day of this election campaign, a think tank, an academic institution, a research organisation is crying out for something bigger and bolder, be that the Institute for Government, I know Reese is here today from them, the IFS, the King's Fund, Demos, all with the same message. And I guess the kind of structural problems they're talking about, amongst other things, are a kind of persistently stagnating economy that's not providing the fiscal revenues we need to pay for our public services, and a relentless increase in demand. That those two of those things together are both kind of cause and consequence of deepening structural inequality, catastrophic reductions in trust. We just heard from Sir John Curtis this morning about that. And for too many people, lives that are diminished, and diminished to an extent that's probably irrecoverable. So tonight, I really want to talk about what those big, bold ideas could and should be for the country, why change is needed, what that might mean, how we get it off the ground and deliver it. And I think in that context, how reform both necessitates political leadership, but in turn enables it as well. Inevitably, I'm going to lean on local government for a number of my descriptions of those things, not least because over the last 14 years or so, councils up and down the country have been at the sharp end of austerity and social change, but also because, frankly, it's a sector I know the best and have been working in for over 20 years or so. And I am going to draw very heavily on the experience of Barking and Dagenham. And as Ben alluded to at the start of this evening's talk, there is a kind of, a caveat in relation to that, which is we are in a purdah period. So these are, just for the avoidance of doubt, these are my personal reflections on that time. They are not the views of the council, and certainly not of the views that they would want to express during an election period. So just if we're all super clear about that. Now, for those of you who don't know much about Barking and Dagenham, it's a London borough, East London borough. If you were to walk down the road, jump on the Jubilee line, go east, get off at West Ham and then continue east to Barking, it'll take you about 35, 40 minutes. You'll get off at Barking Station, which incidentally in 2020 was the 9th busiest railway station in the country, which tells you all you probably need to know about who got to work at home during the pandemic and who didn't. 8th, incidentally, was Birmingham New Street, and 10th was London Victoria. So just everything's kind of going on there. And to some extent, Barking in the post-war period was like an idealized version of the post-war settlement, where a number of the assumptions that kind of underpinned the Beveridge welfare state were kind of true, right? Full male employment, people with pretty decent jobs, a growing industrial economy, the kind of basics in terms of homes and education kind of catered for. The bit that Beveridge didn't really talk about was the assumption that kind of women would be at home doing social care, which is possibly part of the reason why social care is such a mess these days, in terms of like no one really thought about it because we assumed that half the population would be doing it for free. And so why was Barking like that? Well, you had the Becontree estate, the largest public housing estate in the world for many decades, 40-odd thousand council houses built pretty much in the space of 20 to 30 years between the wars and in the period immediately thereafter. Of course, there was the Ford factory in Dagenham that at its height employed 57,000 local people. And of course, the less known story of how the kind of anthropology of Barking and Dagenham, the kind of ethnography of it, was large kinship groups moving from Bethnal Green and the near side of the east side of the city, moving pretty much en masse and in kind of kinship groups to Dagenham in the 1940s and 50s. So that sort of sense of solidarity, of family connection, of identity, of well-being was really clear. And then things started to change, slowly at first, and then really quite suddenly. Ford, in the period in the late 1990s, moved from that huge amount of employment to fewer than 5,000 people. Today, it's about 2,000 people they employ. The right to buy almost halved the number of social houses in that borough, effectively privatizing them, and the majority of those today are now in the private rented sector. That coincided with very, very significant demographic change in that part of London. In the census of 2001, 89% of the population of Barking and Dagenham declared themselves to be of a white British origin. By 2011, that was less than 48%. So huge change in a very short period of time. And there was something else going on as well, a sense that public services were not working in the way that they'd originally been intended. I want to give you just one statistic that demonstrates why I think this is the case. So in 2013, in a borough that was half an hour away from possibly one of the most successful city economies on earth, at a time when we had never spent more on health and social care in the history of mankind, the average healthy life expectancy of women in that borough was 53 years old. Just think about that for a second. 120,000 women and girls, where on a normal distribution, they are so ill in their late 40s and early 50s that they're unable to work and live anything like a normal life that I suspect many of us in this room would take for granted. Now, in that context, like, our solution is to spend more money on health and social care. Certainly, that circumstance was driving massive demand into those public services. The alternative solution that we'll talk about this evening was to work out what on earth was going on in the lives of those women and girls in their 20s and their 30s and their 40s that led to that outcome. In many regards, there was a kind of perfect storm brewing in that part of East London, but it manifested as a riptide. We couldn't see it until its force kind of dragged us under. Does that metaphor work? I think it works. I'm going to stick with it. And that came in 2006, at the height of the New Labour spending years, where new public management was at an all-time high. I can't really criticise it because I was working for the Audit Commission at the time, right? And I was, paying my mortgage and everything, and I kind of believed it. But the point is, new public management said everything was fine in Barking and Dagenham. It's a 3-star council with improving prospects. Do you remember that? And then in 2006, in May of that year, 12 members of the British National Party were elected to the council. No less remarkable because they only stood 13 candidates. Had they stood in every single ward in the borough, they would have taken the council. Imagine that, a fascist political party running a London borough in the run-up to the Olympics. Sounds unimaginable. 2024, there's a prospect of an entire nation being run by a set of far-right politicians welcoming the world to the Olympic Games in Paris. How times have changed. I think at that time, there was something happened and we made it small. I say we. It was described in very much terms as an aberration. Quite patronizing, actually, that a set of ignorant white working class people had been duped by a set of clever far-right people into voting for them. And the task was made one of getting them out of the borough. I'm not suggesting this was a bad thing, by the way, but that's kind of how it was portrayed. There were, however, a set of politicians and social activists locally who I think saw something deeper. They politically saw this as a problem of relationships politically they had with the community they served. There'll be politicians in the room, I'm sure. The notion of contact rates, so how often they knock on people's doors, was below 10%. Since 2010, incidentally, I'm reliably told it's over 90%. So they saw this as kind of a political representation problem, but they also saw it as a public sector problem, that the council was out of touch and wasn't responding to the needs of people in the way they thought. They saw these two things as kind of symbiotic and connected. So I joined the council in 2014, November 2014, and was immediately given a very significant amount of political headroom to think about how we could reform the council to address some of these big systemic problems. And there were sort of two things we had to deal with at that point in time, because austerity was really, really, really biting the council. So there were two things that had to be true. First of all, those reforms had to address the social and economic issues in the borough. Secondly, they had to save money. Right? Those things both had to be true and real, and it had to happen fast. I think, Sharon, you were there at the time, you were there, right? So, and it felt all, I mean, anyway, like there was an urgency to it, wasn't there? And so we didn't have time for pilots or for kind of like longitudinal surveys. We had to sort of fly a little bit by instinct. We knew that growth was a big part of this problem, that we needed to increase the material well-being of people, particularly those who needed growth the most. We also knew that we needed to pivot the council away from like a stance of being very good at receiving problems and need to one that by default was designed to try and prevent and understand them in the first place, form relationships with people and understand the root cause of why they were coming to see us in the first place. And thirdly, we instinctively knew that the council day in, day out had to, as a kind of core mission, build and rebuild relationships of trust with people. I think, again, Sharon, I'm going to point to you because you can tell if I'm making this up now. But we used to talk, didn't we, about, every single time someone has any contact with the council, that is an opportunity either to win trust or destroy it. And we have to be in the business of winning trust and not disrupting it. So to understand all of this, we had to understand what was happening in both a quantitative way and a qualitative way. And what I mean by that, we needed data. So let me give you an example of the kind of data we had to try and understand. About a third of the council's budget was spent on children's social care. And it was really, really important for us to understand what were the kind of root causes and drivers of coming into the children's social care system. If you bring a child into care, you're staring down the barrel of 150, 200, 250,000 pounds of cost per year, potentially for 2 decades. So it's a huge burden. So what we found when we did that root cause analysis was that if you had a household, this is rocket science, but the fact that we had to kind of go out and find it, right, was a thing. If you had a household where there was low income, where there was debt, if that household was in the private rented sector, and if something else bigger was going on, like domestic abuse or a mental health issue, then that household was 8 times more associated with children coming into the care system than if those risk factors were not in place. Now, this is not cause and effect, it's association. But if you're a preventative-minded organisation, you then ask the question, well, how many households in the borough have those risk factors? And the answer was about 3,500. Okay. You can then ask the question, how many of those households are known to the council? To which the answer was about 1,500. So if you're going to adopt a preventative approach, for God's sake, knock on the door of the other 2,000 and check people are okay, because they're the ones at risk. And quite often, those risks have been managed and mitigated in a way that costs a hell of a lot less than £150,000 a year and is better for everybody. I think then what we also found, but I guess the point of all of that was that we had a design problem, because the people who did debt in the council didn't really know that we had people in the council that did domestic abuse. We only had one person in the council, by the way, that did domestic abuse, but anyway, that's by the by. And so we immediately recognized that we were organized to essentially respond to the problems rather than mobilize around those households where, I mean, none of this, the way I say it's like it's obvious, but it was like so not obvious, right? It was like the most not obvious thing in the history of not obvious things. Okay, so we had a design problem, but we also had a relationship problem, because data took us to the people at risk. But then when we found those people, either we had no relationship with them, or the relationship we did have one with them wasn't a good one, right? They didn't trust us. So just imagine your own personal life. I live in Stevenage, right? Try not to look at Ruth, because Ruth used to work for Stevenage Council. I can't imagine a situation where the council would knock on my door and the conversation would go something like this. Hello, my name's Richard. I'm from the council. Richard sounds like an innocuous kind of sounding name, doesn't it? Nice name. I'm Richard. I'm from the council. And according to our data, this household is at risk of an intimate partner episode of violence. Well, you've just prompted one, mate. I'm being frivolous. Let me do the non-frivolous version of this. We were looking at children coming into the care system, as I said before, and we found 72 women who between them had had 237 children taken into care. Just think about that for a second. It is as terrible as it sounds. Mums giving birth on a Monday morning, often women in their late teens, early 20s, and then a social worker on a Wednesday going into the maternity ward and taking the child into care. And then about a year later, it happening again, and a year after that, it happening again. Now, under a classic council, we've done our job. Ofsted would be happy. We have recognised a risk, we have responded to that risk, and we have taken the difficult decision to safeguard that child. But at what cost? Like, the financial cost is off the scale, but the human cost is unbelievable. And so the question then arose, well, isn't it obvious that we need to understand what on earth is happening here? This cycle of conception and loss and trauma. And even as the words come out of my mouth, it's fairly obvious what the problem is. It's a problem of conception, loss, and trauma. And so we say, well, maybe we need to have a different conversation with these women. But of course, the last people they ever want to speak to are the council that keeps taking their children off them. So, it makes me upset even today to think about it. Just give me a second. So, we knew we had to deliver some change. We had to deliver it quickly, and it had to save money. And so we pretty rapidly discounted sort of banging on about systems leadership or kind of culture change. None of these things are bad things, by the way, but they were not sufficient. And we felt we had to take apart the council as it was and put it back together again. So effectively, it understood the totality of people's needs. It formed a relationship of trust with them, and then worked with them in partnership with others to make it happen. And in doing that, we also recognized we could save a load of cash. Okay, so two big things I want to talk about this afternoon before I wrap up. The first was a service that we launched in 2017 called Community Solutions. It's in the book. The point of Community Solutions was essentially to horizontally integrate a series of council services that were most commonly associated with the largest proportion of people holding risk factors. So some aspects of adult social care, some aspects of children's social care, although not a small amount. Debt advice, access to homelessness, drug and alcohol support, domestic abuse, help to get people into work. Mind-blowingly, all of these existed in completely different departments because they're different professional disciplines. We brought them together, and their job essentially was to kind of understand the root cause of why people were coming through the door, work in partnership with them to find the right solution, and then to address it. And it did so with two key attributes. The first was it was designed to both generate data and respond to it. So we got a rich understanding of the common patterns of why people were coming through the door, enabled people to be more predictive and sort of proactive. And secondly, it existed as a platform to essentially kind of both catalyze and respond to the energy and ideas and enthusiasm of both the formal voluntary sector in the borough and the informal voluntary sector. So it became a vehicle for both kind of understanding people's needs in advance of they themselves potentially understanding them in a kind of whole way, responding to those quickly, but also tapping into the energy and support of elsewhere in the council. What I would say is that from day one, like we literally had it, we didn't have it, and then we kind of designed it, and then we flipped into it. In that first year, that service cost 35% less than the prevailing services beforehand, £5 million per year. And those savings unbelievably came from a reasonably simple set of things, like fewer assessment processes. And we had 16 or 17 different assessment processes. Can you imagine the frustration of that for people? Telling the council the same thing over and over again. I'm glad Sharon's nodding. So a single assessment process, a single case management process, a single management assurance process. The numbers added up, and they added up very, very quickly. But we also very rapidly saw those new arrangements bite into demand. So while in the rest of London, homelessness was going up by 17%, I think in the first year, in Barking and Dagenham, it went down by 14%. Within a year, we had no one in bed and breakfast accommodation. And within a year after that, we had almost no one rough sleeping on the streets of Barking. It was working. The second thing I'd say before I wrap up, just conscious of time, was the development of a new function called Be First. Be First was the council's wholly owned growth and regeneration company. I suppose in very, very simple terms, there was a lot of space and land in Barking and Dagenham that could be developed. Space for 70,000 homes, half an hour away from central London. But the market was developing out those homes at a rate of about 700 houses, dwellings a year. So it's going to take a century to build out those homes in a housing crisis in London. This, incidentally, being also the borough that cracked out the Becontree estate in 20 years. Okay, so like that was a point lost on nobody. The other view was like someone was making money out of development in Barking. Why doesn't the council do that as well? Because we're broke and we need the cash. So Be First was essentially designed to increase the pace and scale of growth in the borough. And it did so by recognising two things. One, topically, there was a problem with planning. We didn't have enough planners. We didn't have enough capacity. We didn't have enough leadership to engage in conversations with developers. But we also had a massive market failure. And so the point of Be First was to be a kind of an organisation that could both crowd in public money with private sector money and get stuff built. And within 2 years, housing development in the borough quadrupled. In the period 2020 to 2024, just under a quarter of all affordable homes being built in London were being built in Barking and Dagenham. And that company, in each year of its first 5-year plan, delivered a dividend return to the council of just over £10 million per year. So, okay, by way of wrapping up, lessons. For local leaders, I think there are three that I'd highlight to people. The first is this, that be bold and get on with it. And the reason why I say that is because I genuinely believe that no one is coming to the rescue. And these problems are just going to get worse and worse. In the last few years, I've been supporting councils up and down the country. That's what I felt I wanted to do next, rather than work for a particular council. And inevitably, I'm working with a lot of councils that are under very, very severe financial stress. And without exception, they all wish they'd started earlier. Bit like my son was saying to me at 3 a.m. a couple of Sundays ago in relation to his dissertation. Anyway, he got there. Related to this, I think, is beware of incrementalism and beware of the kind of the allure of the pilot. I don't mean like an airline pilot. I mean, they're very alluring. I mean, I gather. I mean, sort of testing things. My view in the public sector is that 9 times out of 10, like we know if something's going to work or not, and we should just get on with it and not do those things. And then finally, I'd say, if in doubt, like always go back to who is experiencing the most unequal outcomes in my borough and design a future that works for them. Because if you get it right for them, you'll probably get it right for everybody else. My wife Sophie's in the room and is much more succinct than me, which I know is hard for you all to believe. She describes this as designing for the furthest first. And so if in doubt, and you're kind of, I mean, it's very complicated, this stuff, but actually it's not that complicated. If you identified a person experiencing the most structural disadvantage, understand what's happening in their lives and make public services work for them. So look, finally then, for national government, I am incredibly proud of what we achieved with Be First. It was audacious. Like we kind of tussled with international development capital. You know, it's like the business end of capitalism, and we won, and it was great, and it was exhilarating. We got houses built. But I recognise that the context of Barking is not universal to everywhere. It is for certain parts of the country, and where that is the case, there's a lot to learn from the form of that company and what you can do about it. But I think the fundamental point for government is that if you are determined that growth is an essential ingredient of the nation's recovery, which is obvious it is, then it's imperative that we recapitalise regional and local government to be able to fully participate in the actions that only they can expedite to deliver that growth. Otherwise, what you're going to end up with is kind of what's happened with a lot of the levelling up funding, which is hanging baskets in the town centre and the hope that that might encourage people to go to Debenhams, right? It's not, right? You know? Anyway, But I think my final point is, I think the model we developed with a few modifications in relation to community solutions, is a winner. And there's a number of us, Catherine, Ruth, and some other colleagues in the room. We've been working with councils up and down the country, deploying similar models in places as diverse as Fife, Middlesbrough, Stockton-on-Tees, Salford, Liverpool, even Birmingham, which is a whole other essay to be written, but not by me, so that's good. And without exception, a very, very similar pattern emerges. About a third of the population holding very similar risk factors that the local state is not designed to join up around, and if it were, you get significant one-off immediate savings and you bite into demand. And my view is, given our current circumstances, we cannot leave it to chance. We can't say, here's some best practice. And so my proposition, the proposition that's in this paper, is that an incoming government should launch something that I call a national New Start programme, a new institution of the state deployed in neighbourhoods across the country that brings together core parts of primary care, mental health, CAMS, core functions of local government, specifically debt and money advice, homelessness, housing, drug and alcohol, domestic abuse, with core functions of DWP, specifically Job Centre Plus, and access to support into housing. Because without exception, the people who will be most using those services on the balance of probability will be using the others, and we make it incredibly frustrating for them. And I hear people say to me, yes, we're doing that in our area. We've got a partnership. And I'm like, no. Or we've co-located in some places as part of a pilot. And I'm like, no, it doesn't work. Well, it might work. It might bring some benefits, but it's not going to save the money. So my view, a new institution, get on with it, bring those functions together, helping people with their health needs, access to housing, access to work, access to support and help them with money problems, because there's a lot of people with money problems. It's a bold vision. It works. It could be as significant in its impact as the launch of the NHS 80 years ago. It could help millions of people. I think people intuitively understand it. It will save billions, and it has the prospect of reconnecting us with each other, with the state, and between the state and politicians who are able to make something happen. And that's what I think we should do. Thank you.
Thank you. Just remind us to hold the mic nice and close.
I'm going to try the same trick, but I'm going to have the same problem of possibly not seeing my notes or you. So it's going to be a really good combination. I've never met Chris before. And so when they sent me the report, I thought, wonder why they're asking me to look at this. And as I read it, I thought, well, they just want to cheer me up. That's the real reason. It's I think the report is a thing of beauty. I've worked on the political economy of the state in different European contexts since 1997, and it's the first thing I've ever read where I thought, this has got real people in it. It's got three-dimensional people in it who are generous, vulnerable, fallible, who don't make perfect calculations in a well-functioning machine. So I thought what I could try and do is take it back to first principles and talk about why I think it works. It's the economist joke about, well, it works in practice, but does it work in theory? So I want to try and talk about the sort of first principles that I think make this work. And that to pick up, I want to do four things, really. I want to talk about why Chris is right that you need transformative solutions and you can't patch what we have. So I want to talk about why patching won't work. I want to talk about why this way of thinking about things has innovative capacity built into it. So you're not doing what we've done so much in the last 45 years of building one set of institutions and then putting all your focus into dealing with the unintended consequences of the thing you just built without a reflexive capacity to manage that. The third thing is why I think it's worth distilling the principles of this and thinking about how they apply to all state institutions, because I'm going to talk about a few where I can immediately see where the same governing philosophy applies. And the last thing is that I think this way of thinking closes what is still a yawning gulf between the way the Conservative and Labour parties think about growth and ecological economics. And that's a gulf we need to bridge. So I want to talk about why I think this is the way across it. So the first thing I think we need to register that we forget, and we forget it partly because we've been living in a more or less neoliberal regime for 45 years. So we treat it as a sort of natural condition that we can't escape. But the thing I think to register is that all governance systems have underlying beliefs about the nature of the social reality and how they think it works and what they think they can know about it. And it's really important to take a good hard look at what those kind of underlying assumptions are. And in terms of developing governments that can function, it's the ball game. Because if you believe that you live in a computable world, if you believe that you can apprehend society well enough that you can come up with a governing science that is good for all times and places, then your philosophy of what government is for will change, because you say, well, we know what an efficient economy looks like. So we're going to build public institutions and corporate governance law and regulatory regimes to fulfill the theoretical blueprint in the deep belief that society will then conform to those institutions because we got the science right and everything will become more efficient. And that is the kind of machine model of the economy that I'm going to talk about, because that is the neoliberal understanding of reality. But the alternative is that you say, we don't live in a computable world. We live in a world that is always becoming something else. It is an evolving ecosystem. Individuals are not predetermined. We have imagination. That means we flout most social theories kind of every day. And our freedom lives in that imagination and that capacity for creativity and changing our minds. We are people who think, love, fight, learn, get frustrated, have coping mechanisms, very few of which will conform to a machine model of the political economy for more than about 5 minutes. And that is a world of ecosystems and biological metaphors. So we have two kind of, I mean, we can think of others, but I want to draw your attention to a distinction between a machine world and an economics that thinks in terms of a machine world, and an evolutionary world that says we live with radical uncertainty. And that's the one philosophy of science backs up for various reasons. Kantian philosophy of science, we can't escape the history of our own curiosity. There's no Archimedean place where we can stand to apprehend the world in all its clarity. And also, because we're imaginative, the world is always becoming something else. So neoliberalism and the economics, the neoclassical economics of the last 45 years, on which the British state has been rebuilt, is the machine model. And my ecologist friend here is more interested in the Chelsea Flower Show. And I think that's probably better for all of us. The dark historical joke that I've been sort of writing about, and that this is the perfect counterpoint against, is that the neoclassical economics behind British economic policy and state reform of the last 45 years and actually Soviet economics are mirror images, because they're both sciences of the efficient allocation of things. They go from the art of government to a deterministic model of the political economy that says we have the governing science that is good for all times and places, and now we're going to build the institutions that conform to that model. And what they hold in common and what stands them apart from all previous British ideologies and economic forms of economic reasoning is their arguments from assumption, their arguments from utopian assumption. Neoclassical economics is axiomatic deductive, right? It uses formal mathematics and modeling and logic from formal assumptions, borrowed from physics mostly, about how a rational individual will navigate commodity space, and all of economic modeling is about trying to create a taxonomy of the economic world. And when Stalin has to turn Leninism into a procedure, where you go from dogma to procedure and we come up with complete central planning, it's the state planning version of the commodity space that neoclassical economics models. And Vilfredo Pareto in 1902 talked about how the perfectly planned economy and the perfect market economy are formal mirror images. And the dark historical joke that we've been playing out is we've been trying to make it work, and because it's a world of computation, believing that we live in a world of calculable risk, not of uncertainty, we live in a world of output planning, target setting, rational enterprises who will only ever behave in system-consistent ways, we basically converge on the same statecraft as Soviet economics. So what we've done is built Soviet state failures in capitalist form, which is quite an achievement. And it's working about as well as you would expect that to go. And what people forget, because it was a long time ago and because their political values were completely opposed, Stalinist economics and neoclassical economics share the same form of economic reasoning. They're misadventures in high modernism that say we can quantify the world around us and we can build institutions to conform to that, and the riddle of history is solved, right? And so, just to give you an example, if we take public sector outsourcing, so the neoclassical justification for public sector outsourcing, and indeed the new Labour justification for beginning academy schools, as an example, quasi-markets in welfare, was to say, we'll create a world of choice and competition. The state will create a market game of competitive service provision, but because this is a formal model in logic, the state disappears out of the picture. And what you have then is the only interface that you can model in a neoclassical way, which is between customers and service providers, which sounds great. It's very intuitively compelling. We'll have choice, we'll have competition, it'll be brilliant. But because the state doesn't wither away, like it didn't wither away in the Soviet system, what you've actually recreated is a massive Soviet enterprise planning structure. You've got the mass state planning of private enterprises. And because those contracts are the juncture of control, you have literally recreated the Soviet planning architecture, and you get into all the bargaining games and pathologies that the Soviet enterprise planning structure got into. So you're creating an institutional dynamic, you're using machine philosophy for an evolving world, creating institutions to conform to the blueprint. And then when those institutions take on an evolutionary life of their own, because we live in an evolving world, the system of analysis you have can't even describe the dynamics that emerge, let alone solve them. And so that's the problem we get into with patching. So patching in this frame would be what mainstream economics and Blairite economics did, which is so-called second best world neoclassical economics, that says, yes, the market heuristic of perfect competition and perfectly informed individuals is utopian, but it's the right benchmark for judging how markets fail. So you have a neoclassical formal economics, which is about how do you mend market failures? It's missing markets, it's pricing in the externalities, it's information failures, it's creating markets where they're missing. But that isn't as that's no more metaphysically neutral than the Friedmanite version, because you're basically confusing an act of logic, which is that you're connecting all the circuits in a perfectly functioning machine. So you're making a step in logic, it's kind of blackboard determinism that you can't reproduce in the social world. And that's what we spend our lives doing. And again, the dark historical joke is, how do you do that? Well, you often do it through regulatory systems, more targets, more synoptic control, more output planning. And so you do exactly what the Soviets did through the 60s and 70s, which is when the basic plan doesn't work, you create whole new exoskeletons of bureaucratic control to try and make the damn machine conform. And we're at the worst point of that. It's kind of neoliberalism, the Brezhnev years at this point, because we're at the point where all the three-dimensional dynamics of our institutions are things that the governing economics can't describe and can't solve, because none of it conforms to the expectations of the theory. And so when I read Chris's report, it's like being a cartoon figure that's been steamrollered in kind of Roadrunner and going, oh, 3 dimensions. You kind of peel yourself up off the 2-dimensional logical floor and you get to be a whole person. And it's a beautiful thing. And it's built around the idea that we are complex, we are changing, there is the potential for collective intelligence. And so I want to talk, I'm rambling, so let me stop rambling and run through innovation and adaptability. So because the system assumes that we're creatures in an ecosystem of changing sources of harm, but not random sources of harm, there's kind of organized difficulty that has patterns and that you can explore and discover things about it. But because it accepts complexity, it basically says life is perplexing, people have multiple sources of distress potentially. Instead of pretending that isn't the case, it embraces the fact that it's the case and creates teams of people with very diverse forms of expertise to work with the agent, who is the person who is suffering, and to treat them as the most informed person about their situation. So it's kind of deeply human in that respect. But it's also completely resonant with the literature on the most innovative firms in the private sector. One of the peculiar things about neoliberalism is it's all based in theory. It shows a remarkable lack of curiosity about actual firms in actual economies. So if you look at really innovative actual firms, they're not made innovative and adaptive by individuals. They tend to have the capacity for heterarchy. In other words, they use very diverse frames of expertise, of reference, of register, of valuation, and they actively go out and look for interesting problems to solve. They don't try and avoid complexity. They're interested in complexity and they go and look for it and they deal with it in that way. It's also worth noting that hierarchy as a word has a theological background from the 5th century. And the person at the top of the hierarchy was closest to God. It's the angels, and it's the miserable sinners who are at the bottom of the hierarchy. I think it's worth bearing that in mind when we think that there will be all that knowledge at the top and the people at the bottom know nothing. We are the miserable sinners. So it's worth registering the kind of built-in theological beliefs where we have very hierarchical structures. So that capacity to harness the collective intelligence from the smallest charities to local firms, to volunteers, to the experts in the team was, I think, an amazing source of strength. Also worth noticing production regimes that produce the most complex goods, if we're going to get away from the human economy and into manufacturing again, the thing neoliberals don't actually pay attention to. German car manufacturing is so successful as a complex production regime because it takes tacit knowledge seriously. It builds teams with complex expertise. It's relatively flat. It's relational. It's not based on competition. They share. Firms collaborate on everything from R&D, skills training, technology, you name it, because the market won't do those things. They're too complex. So this has resonances in real economies that are brilliant at doing complex things, even before we take it back to the human economy. So lessons for other places. I read this and I immediately thought there's a fantastic literature on from Charles Sable and David Victor, political economists who've written about governance and innovation for decades in the US context, and they're writing about how to solve the climate crisis. And they're talking about experimental governance and how important it is when you're facing crises characterized by radical uncertainty. And we have a lot of those at this point. And so they give the example of the California Air Resources Board, which had 12 members, but they included 2 members of the general public, as well as a meteorologist, an air pollution expert, an automotive engineer, a chemist, and members of the heads of the different air pollution areas. And what they did was collaborate with firms, but with their own expertise, to say, if you improve technological standards, we're going to make that the new benchmark for regulation, but we're going to help you achieve new technological standards. We won't regulate you to drive you to do things you can't do yet, but as soon as you can, that's the bottom line. And if you don't comply with it, you won't be allowed to sell cars in California. So it was a fantastic mix of sticks, carrots, and collaborative work, and very experimental and very adaptive. And it seems to me that that logic of collective intelligence, tacit knowledge, teamwork, taking everybody's knowledge seriously, relational coordination, is something that is a basic set of principles that's completely different from the bureaucratic Taylorism that comes with neoclassical economics. It's completely different. It embraces complexity and finds it exciting and massively creative. And that would be good, not just for everyone in the country, but everyone in the public sector who feels like they're being squished into this 2-dimensional form, who could then use their full creative selves. So the final point, really is the final point, is that anyone interested in the ecological emergency will be continuously struck by the tension between the Labour movement and the Conservative Party and ecological and the Greens and ecological economics. And we shouldn't be surprised by that. I mean, the 20th century, the Labour movement is born in the desire to end inequality, to grow the pie in order to, well, to redistribute, but to grow the pie in order to be able to redistribute more and to sort of level everything up. But within the 20th century terms of, maximal production, maximal growth. And ecological economics starts from the natural sciences and says, the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of nature. We need to go from that principle and reverse engineer a form of economics that's going to not get us all killed. And ne'er the twain shall meet, apparently. And I think ne'er the twain shall meet when you have a machine model of the economy, because it's impossible to imagine, just metaphorically, methodologically, narratively, how you move from the high modernist machine that says we have mastery over nature, we have the governing science, we can quantify everything, we live in a computable world, to having anything to do with ecosystems. I mean, it's just a whole other world. But you're not using those, you're using biological metaphors, it seems to me. So to finish off, I wanted to list, I'm taking this from a different book about organization, and I'm going to list the characteristics, and I want you to tell me if they're very compatible with what you've done and what you're trying to do. So, facilitate self-organized networks, aggregate scattered parts into something greater, cultivate diversity and independence, communicate through open, two-way, always-on conversations, trigger tipping point decisions with simple rules and feedback loops, align action around a compelling shared purpose, launch many parallel low-investment experiments. Not even in the social organisation, the grants to the social organisation.
Yeah, no, you're right. Actually, it's true. It's true, yeah.
It can be wrong. It can be no. It's very right. So
I wish I'd read this book. Saved a lot of effort.
Tune social networks to spread innovation or suppress it where it's damaging. Zip specialised modular teams together as needed. Slightly with your expertise between the different levels of distribute local leadership to integrate local information. Share the work and the wealth and protect collective value from parasites. Slightly. And finally,
that's exactly how we put it.
First. Build with infinite stuff and regenerate it for compounding wealth. Kind of. Anyway, so. This is a book called Teeming, How Superorganisms Work Together to Build Infinite Wealth on a Finite Planet. and it's by an evolutionary biologist. Right? It's about how nature perpetuates itself through cooperative action, but particularly superorganisms like the ants, whales, you name it. And it strikes me that if I can find that kind of resonance in 5 minutes, we might be onto something in finding a way of talking about government that isn't on a different planet to the ecological question.
Thank you, Abby.
Magnificent. Thank you so much. Thanks, Ben. How to follow that. That was wonderful. I learned so much. Well, it's so fantastic to be here, in part, obviously, because, as has been said, the document that Chris has written, which we have read and thought about and which we're discussing tonight, is just a masterpiece of exposition. It is so inspiring, so uplifting, so generative of energy at a time when many of us sort of struggle to find that kind of hope and optimism in our everyday experience. So it's just been a joy to read it. You'll have, if you haven't read it already, you've got a real treat to look forward to. And so it's wonderful to have any chance to talk about it. It's also a real personal pleasure for me to be having this conversation here at Demos. So I first started to think about these questions, the questions that Chris has raised in the paper, in the sort of immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Gordon Brown government, so in 2010. And I came to have those conversations because of Demos. So at that period in time, Demos tried to bring together thinkers, practitioners, campaigners, community organizations to reconceptualize what progressive social government ought to be after the end of the New Labour project. And it wasn't in this building back then, but I remember gathering for those conversations with some wonderful people and hearing in those conversations, I think, the beginnings of what was then able to be put into practice in Barking and Dagenham. And so it's a joy to be having this chat here. But at the same time, also, so many of those thinkers in those conversations would go into having some kind of role in the work that is so brilliantly described in Chris's piece. So the person who convened that Demos group was Graham Cook, who then went off to Barking and Dagenham and has now gone off to work for Sue Gray. Tessie Britton was part of those conversations, who obviously led participatory city work out in Barking and Dagenham. And of course, parliamentary leadership from John Cruddas was absolutely fundamental to generating that sort of critique and enthusiasm and engagement for having quite deep conversations about what the state ought to be and what the state's relationship with the citizen ought to be as well. So I feel, in one way, this is a sort of second bite at that cherry, terrible metaphor, but you know what I mean, that we all gathered back then in 2010, 2011 to begin to articulate a set of principles, a set of visions, a set of ideas. And now we gather again, partly after that work has been done and proven so successful in the ways that we've heard about tonight in Barking and Dagenham and in other places, but also, of course, on the cusp of a general election, which might create the opportunities to be able to do the kind of work that we've heard called for at a national level, or at least to cascade these examples out more broadly across the country. So I don't want to talk for too long, but I do want to suggest a kind of question of, is this a national moment at which the lessons which are described in Chris's paper can be cascaded nationally? Or is this a different kind of moment, a sort of moment of disappointment, more akin to another political option that I had when I worked for Ed Miliband in 2015. Now, I don't think we'll have the same kind of night on July this year as we had back in May 2015, but it may be that the sort of the glory that could be grabbed if we were to follow the recommendations in this report might be missed. And if so, we will all regret it. So I wanted to sort of articulate three concerns I have about this political moment, not to sort of generate despair or despondency on what otherwise should be an uplifting occasion, but so that we all know what our targets might be as we try to advance this work in the months and years ahead. So I have a slightly different take in this regard from some others in the room, I think, which is to say that I'm overall optimistic about what this political moment might be able to generate. And I'm not overly concerned about incrementalism in the same way that Chris is, in the sense that I believe that the agenda could be advanced relatively slowly, piece by piece, in a way which is befitting of the personality of our presumably soon-to-be Prime Minister, but nonetheless still moving in the direction that most of us gathered here would like to see. So my concern isn't incrementalism per se, but I do have three other concerns, and I wanted to put them out there and see if they're shared. The first other concern is perhaps the most obvious, which is sort of techno-utopianism. Throughout this campaign, and I think the months which have preceded it, when you're looking for glimmers of optimism about public service reform, about the redesign of service models, about the refoundation of the National Health Service, about ways in which you can achieve the things that Chris has described of saving money but also improving services, my instinct is that far too often we wave a kind of techno fairy in the air and claim that somehow artificial intelligence is going to solve all of these problems for us. That was very much present. I don't know if people followed the Conservative Manifesto launch yesterday, but the argument about National Health Service reform in the Conservative Manifesto is largely about utilising artificial intelligence as a device to do diagnostics, which apparently is going to save lots and lots of money, which can then go into national insurance cuts or whatever it was that it was going to go into. But the suggestion there is that technology by itself is going to reform the nature of our public services. You will presumably see elements of that also in the Labour Party manifesto when it's revealed tomorrow, and certainly it's been a core component of elements of the Tony Blair Institute's work over the last 18 months or so, and in elements of Wes Streeting's public discourse and dialogue around health service reform too. Now, what I'm not suggesting is that technology has no role to play, and it couldn't be an exciting element of the reformulation that we all hope to see. But what is very interesting about it, and to use Abby's framing, is it does seem like a machine solution rather than an evolutionary solution. So the instinct by utilizing technology is often that you can simply plug it in and it will do the work for you. And you don't need to grapple with issues of relationship building, with place and belonging, or even more importantly, perhaps issues of power and control. The most dystopian moment, I think, probably of my last 2 or 3 years was attending a big public service reform conference, thousands of people in a very fancy hotel in London, and seeing a very sort of highly fated speaker suggesting that the way that schools should be run now is all through devices such as this, where you could have real-time monitoring of performance from a private company based in California. And the suggestion was that all our parents would get a little ping on our phone, that my daughter Freya unfortunately has failed her maths test, and this is appalling, and therefore should be or whatever it is, no pudding for a week. The ease with which this finds its way into our political vocabulary and into the bloodstream of the plans for a reforming government, I think, is deeply concerning. So that's one bundle of issues that I wanted to put in the room. The second bundle of issues, again, is a relatively straightforward but nonetheless really powerful concern, which is, of course, bureaucratic path dependence, which is that we see, I think, partly as a result of the impact of austerity in the way that Chris has described, an openness and an enthusiasm to reform in at least large parts of local governments, which has been tremendously exciting. And you'll all have participated, I'm sure, or many of you will, in the new local conferences on Stronger Things, or we ran a conference called Britain Renewed out at UCL East a couple of weeks ago, when you have practitioners from different local authorities experimenting, exploring, perhaps not big enough, perhaps not bold enough, but nonetheless understanding the relational dynamics, the uncertainty elements, all of these suggestions that we've heard explored tonight. It's much rarer currently to have those conversations with people who work just up here in Whitehall. It's not impossible, and they do exist, and there definitely are pockets of innovation and reform in the national government, but many, many senior civil servants have not even begun this conversation, have not even had this conceptual sort of reflection, let alone do the much harder work of turning it into a concrete plan for government. And I think there are causes for concern when you think of what does the first 100 days of a new government look like? What does the first 12 months of a new government look like? What are the mechanisms? And Ben, I see, has been tweeting about some of this recently as well, where you, instead of looking for the bold and the new and the radical and the relational, you pull off the shelf the delivery units of 1997, and off we go to the sort of neoliberal public management, new public management wacky races. So a kind of question about innovation, creativity, and reflexivity within the core civil service, I think, is another conversation we need to have. The third challenge, I think, that we face is a challenge of political leadership, which is to say there are so many of us who have been sort of, it's exactly as Abby was describing. When you read Chris's report, it's palpably exciting. It's not only good social science or good public management, but it fulfills a rhetorical function too. It's an organizing device. It gets people to turn up at meetings like this tonight, even though you've got many other things to do. And that's because it makes sense. It provides solutions to problems that we thought were otherwise insoluble, and it has real human emotion at its core. But nonetheless, it remains extremely rare that it functions in the political rhetoric of our political leadership. So if you can think about how many times have you seen reference and relevance to these kind of experiments and experiences within mainstream political communication, it's a very small number. Now, I want to close on a hopeful note, though, which is I don't think it's a vanishingly small number. And I do think that there are core elements of what is being presented to the country in a couple of weeks' time, which suggests that some of these themes and some of these ideas are going to find the political leaders that they will need to champion them through this process. And in particular, I just want to put two quick thoughts out there. I've been very struck, as some of you will know, by two continual themes in the leadership of Keir Starmer. And this isn't an advert for Keir Starmer. You can vote for whoever you want for, and there are many failings in the Labour side as well as on all the other sides. But there are two things that Starmer has said which I think resonate very powerfully with the agenda we're talking tonight. The first is his continual reference to what he calls ordinary hope rather than utopian hope, which seems to me to sort of resonate with very many of the themes that we've had in this discussion. And the second is this continual return to the issue that Ben talked about at the start, which is of the need to respect people as agents of change and not just as the recipients of government beneficence. And if we can stitch together that belief in the power of the ordinary and the necessity of our political class rebuilding a relationship of trust and respect with the citizenry, then you could imagine a political rhetoric and a political form of leadership which can generate the kind of support that the initiatives that we've been talking about here need tonight. So in conclusion, those are my three challenges. How do we ensure that technology doesn't knock all this off? How do we ensure that innovation, creativity, and especially relationality finds itself at the heart of Whitehall and not just at the heart of local authorities? And what do we all need to do to ensure that political leadership is thinking about these issues front and center to be able to drive the change through upon which we all eventually depend? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. No, it's brilliant. Okay, we will now take some questions from the audience. I don't know who is taking questions. Samaya, sorry to pick on you. Who's taking questions? Shall I walk around? Are you going to walk around? Put your hand up if you want to ask a question, and I'll sort of randomly point at you. So we've got one over here, and then we'll take the one in the middle. So if you could just say your name and if you want to an organisational affiliation, be there. Thanks.
So I'm Rachel Morgan. I'm a civil servant, and I'm going to extend your criticism with the civil servant. So I want to talk about sort of how you think this can navigate what I see as potentially two big dangers. And I'll give two examples. One is that everyone in government, everyone in Parliament, and everyone on the street knows what should be on the curriculum, the national curriculum. And we have a tendency to try and tinker constantly. Oh, add this. Oh, this is a good idea. Like, great. The other danger is, I remember Ian Duncan Smith took weekly board meetings of the DWP IT system before UC was coming in or something like that. So it's like that micromanagement, because if he stares the civil servants in the eyes and he stares the suppliers in the eyes, they'll deliver. So there's the two sort of dangers I can see by, when you said the word institution, I felt very tired immediately, because I'm not only a civil servant, I'm a financial civil servant. So, you've got to, those, I just think, how do you think we navigate that? Or how would you navigate that?
Thanks, Rachel. And then there was one sort of in the middle. Yes, thank you.
Hi, I'm Sam Mercadante. I'm from the National Council for Voluntary Organizations. And Chris, I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the role of the voluntary sector in the work that you did, particularly kind of thinking about that like buyer-provider relationship that's driven by kind of viewing all of this through a procurement lens and a commissioning lens.
Great. So, question about what's the role for the third sector in all of this, and then a sort of, I guess, a plea for change from Rachel, and a great anecdote around Ian Duncan Smith's micromanagement. I guess it leads into the interesting question, which Mark was alluding to, of how do you change political styles on this stuff, which I agree is one of the main barriers. But Chris, do you want to kick off on the third sector, and then maybe we'll come to Abby and Mark on the political leadership?
Yes, I will. So, well, the honest answer is by sort of 2014-15 in Barking and Dagenham, we weren't really spending anything on the community and voluntary sector. So the dilemma of the sort of heartache and anger and whatever words you want to use to describe the relationship, none of those are good words, by the way, were they? Like, we'd sort of gone past that point. I think we maybe had like £50,000 a year and we were commissioning the CVS or something, and it was just not right. So, but to some extent that kind of liberated a different kind of conversation. And we involved the formal community and voluntary sector very heavily in the design of the community solutions model. Sort of citizens' advice were kind of built in from day one. The other observation that sort of you can kind of discern probably from the report, but it was not really clear, is that sort of civil society in Barking Dagenham is reasonably weak. So if you talk to, no, I'm not going to name the name, but you talk to some political leaders in central London boroughs, and they will say their problem is they've got too much civil society. They've got like 7 bloody universities. They've got, whatever, museums. You can probably guess which borough I'm talking about in a minute. Like that was not our problem. And so part of this was actually just kind of catalyzing a sense of autonomy and people coming together to support each other. And then at the right moment, trying to kind of formalize that in arrangements. But we sort of started with a conversation about how we help people, rather than a conversation about sort of money. I'd like to say something about incrementalism, but you can well, do that, yeah. Well, it might be a segue into. All right, okay. Well, I'll say it. So I think my sort of thing about incrementalism, and by the way, this is a document that's kind of shared with love with an incoming progressive government, right? It's not meant to make life difficult for them. It's meant to sort of illuminate what the change proposition might need to look like. I think I've got 2 thoughts on it, really. First of all, there's a massive difference between having an incremental strategy and incremental delivery. Okay, so my personal view is that both bring risk, but like sort of incrementally deciding how you're going to move forward and what your end state is a stupendously bad idea. Even if you're wrong, like be clear what your end state is, even if then tactically you're moving towards it in an incremental way. And this is just like scars on my back. I'm a former finance director. What you'll find is if you're not careful, if you incrementally move to that end state, you'll never get the cash out. It will just sort of evaporate somewhere into the ether. But what I would not underestimate is the staggering immunity to change of professionally led public sector silos and departments. there's an incredibly compelling dynamic that is sort of based around responding to need. Like, who wouldn't want more doctors, more hospitals, more nurses, more prisons, and actually trying to like bring those forces together is incredibly difficult. And my big worry was, if you kind of try and implement that over a decade period, you're never going to get there, because the level of sort of narrative holding, like organizational leadership, is immense. And I think, generally speaking, you have sufficient political capital to have like one shot at this. And that would be my anxiety, I think, in relation to an incoming government wanting to make change. So I'd say be super clear on what that mission is, but the mission being the end state. Then think very carefully about your strategy to get there. And I think the longer and more drawn that out that is, the greater the risk you're never going to get there. And that then brings with it kind of huge challenges in relation to kind of promises made and all the rest of it.
Mark, do you have anything to say on incrementalism?
I mean,
a bit of a debate going here.
Yeah, I mean, I could definitely look at the merits of that argument are really apparent, and it makes an awful lot of sense. I think the political challenge, and I don't mean it in a sort of party politics competitive challenge, I mean more in a kind of what does the country want, it is largely that we've had enough of big, booming, overpromised, abstract stories, and because we were told that Brexit was going to get done and that was going to sort everything out. If you were on the left, you were told there was going to be a whole new economic order. People, the polling is really clear. We published this Respect to Gender poll with More in Common at the beginning of the week, and something like 76% of the public, when you ask them what are their priorities for the next government, and consider this as a change election, 76%, it's the biggest number, say they want stability. And that's not because they like what they've currently got. They think what they've currently got is awful. So they definitely want it to change, but they don't want chaos, sort of disruption, division, polarization, and anger, because they think they've had that like since 2015, and it's in the large part of the public's mind, it's the cause of the problem. So I think if you are an incoming government wanting to do the kind of reforms that I think most in the room are in favour of, the challenge is you can't say to people, we've got a big, booming, big bang solution, guys, because people will say, oh, hold on a minute, we've had too much of that. We don't believe you. We don't think it will work. And then you have like distrust from day one. So I think that the challenge for an incoming government is how do you do, that's one of the reasons I think that Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer talk so much about 10-year story, is that they believe you've got to build trust back first before you ask anyone to do anything difficult. Now, I totally see the challenges of that, but I worry that in the context within which we currently exist, nothing else is really possible.
Abby, did you want to...
Yeah, a couple of things. The inability to innovate is one of the reasons the Soviet system collapsed. And I think when you're asking professionals within current systems to innovate, that sense of total exhaustion and is going to be overwhelming. And it's that thing of, can you persuade them that this is going to be a whole different level of agency that will come with that innovation? Otherwise, they hear it as, well, I can't do what I'm meant to do within my existing budget, and you want me to innovate? Which was also the Soviet sort of pathology. So I think there's that context. The curriculum thing is interesting because it's this sort of functionalism as well about, how can you make the curriculum more functionalist? So I think for the wider economy and so on. So I think that question of who should have discretion is one that we really need to revisit, because we now have this mad central planning system with a totally disaggregated academy system that then holds their own budgets, and there's really every Soviet pathology you could think of in that system. So that really would need revisiting in general, I think. But this also, your point about sort of trying to stare down providing companies, hoping that they'll then comply. Also, the Soviet pathology that because the state remains financially, politically, and legally liable for the provision of the service that will still need to be provided when that company doesn't bother or goes bankrupt or basically stops, doing the minimalist reading of the contract, you're in the Soviet condition of bargaining games that the state never wins because all the moral hazard is on the side of the state. And on the techno-optimism, the Soviets tried that in the 1960s, and it was called cybernetics. And the idea was that you would, they had a wonderful name for it, which was perfect indirect centralization, which was that you would use mathematics and computing. So it was taking rocket science, literally, it was taking the computing that came out of cybernetic rocket control, Kantorovich, people like that, and said, this will be amazing. You could have the perfect aggregation of all the dispersed information as if you had an omniscient central planner, but without it having to go through a bureaucratic center. And it failed politically, but they also gave it up because they understood they didn't have godlike foreknowledge about future needs or change. And so they recognized that, like Narcissus, the cybernetic managers would have a pool of data, but they'd all be gazing back at their own reflection, right? And all the confirmation bias that went with what they were choosing to measure. So we've tried that, didn't work brilliantly. I love the idea that the leading edge of techno-optimism in the neoliberal state is something the Soviets gave up as excessively bureaucratic in the 1960s. and we've just got to get out of the high modernist loop, right? We've got to accept that we are human beings in an uncertain world and build institutions, as they did in the post-war era, to make us more resilient in an uncertain world.
Some people in the industry have heard me use this metaphor before, so apologies. My big worry about all of the techno stuff in the context of a state that is very difficult to reform is that you end up, like, imagine it's like 2004 and HMV have created a website, right? And there's a set of blokes with mullets on the board of HMV going, we need a bit of this techno stuff. But the department that does CDs and records and tapes and like the whole kind of supply chain distribution function cannot get his head round Spotify, right? And I think, and this then comes back to this point about sort of, without wanting to labor it, the kind of incrementalism point, right? Because that's an example of incremental strategy that then led to catastrophic failure for that business, as opposed to really clear strategy and potentially an incremental. I mean, God knows how long it took Spotify to build what they did, right? But you can imagine that was the only option that HMV had. Like, do they go fast? Do they go slow? But not, do they go somewhere? And they sort of dithered. And I think, like, why did that happen? I think there are a lot of parallels between that sort of example and the sorts of things which I was talking about, which is why in my mind, like, are we going to build Spotify? If so, let's get on with it. Or are we going to what was your patch? We're going to patch it. Anyway.
We're going to do 3 questions from the floor. We haven't had as much time for questions as I would have liked, which I apologise. I mean, the discussion's been very good. You can come badger the speakers afterwards and make them late to their next evening plans. So we'll go one here, Johnny, and then Jack. So yeah, just there. Thanks, Mike.
Hi, thank you. My name's Cheryl Bannerman. The decision to go fast or slow changes when the conditions around you change. For example, COVID-19. And I know, Chris, we've spoken a lot about how important it was for you guys to accelerate in that condition, but you'd already started the foundation. So it was easier for you to target those people, the furthest person first, the people that were really in need. Do you think councils have actually learned from that, as in we need to start equipping ourselves now? We might not have another COVID-19, but we may have another situation that will need us to react in those situations. Or do you think they are still in budgets? There's too many challenges, we can't think that far.
Hello, Johnny Manson, former colleague of Chris's, current incumbent of a Big Four consultancy. I'd separately love to have a conversation with Abby about the Soviet pathologies that exist in the Big Four landscape at the moment, but that is a separate conversation. So New Start. I think you called it New Start, Chris. A kind of new sure start, but more, and doing more things and better. So I guess my question is, how do we create the political space for the scale of institutional change that you are kind of implying in that kind of view of the world? And how do you avoid the integrated care trap?
Hi, Jack Shaw from Labour Together and the Productivity Institute. I mean, my interpretation of much of what you said. Does this work? Can you hear me?
Yeah, maybe just
Lovely.
Yeah.
My interpretation of much of what you said was about injecting humanity to our governing principles and our public policy. And so a question to you, Chris, was, and building on the words that Marcus said here about hope and respect in particular, was there a kind of specific language that you heard time and time again? And I reflect on the fact that in Japan, for example, love is a kind of quite big feature of their public policy, and that feels very alien to us here. And then just a very quick second question. Much of this debate has highlighted the kind of absence of our participatory governance and how we kind of access the insight of communities. And do you have any views on the best ways we can kind of harness that?
Great. So participatory governance, love. Johnny's had a question about how do we stop ICBs, potentially some of the critiques of them happening again. And then the question, which I'm not going to try and summarize, but Chris is going to answer because it was such a good question. Over to you.
Okay, so I think what was really interesting about the COVID is it forced councils up and down the country to adopt a risk-based predictive model of who's at risk of harm, and required councils to flip the paradigm on its head and not wait for people with COVID to come through the door, but go and get to them before they caught COVID. It was remarkable. And also, for those of you a bit geeky about these things, they invoked a kind of command structure inside their councils, like gold command. I mean, it's all ridiculous. Like, you know, I was like gold leader or something. It's like something out of Star Wars or something. But, I was seconded to Birmingham City Council during the pandemic. And so at 8 o'clock in the morning, we'd look at the data. Like the data was so granular. Like we knew like our person in Solihull who'd like caught COVID, where they got it, right? It was like GDPR. Didn't know the names, but like the dot. The point I'm running towards is that we had data, but then we used a command structure to mobilize our organizations because we knew there was not a cat in hell's chance of those departments joining up and working with the community and voluntary sector and with neighbors and friends unless we essentially mandated it. And then when COVID went away, we went, oh, that's fine, and off we went. Now, there's a sort of argument here, which I don't think is like where we're at, by the way, but you could imagine if it keeps getting as bad as it could get over the next 5 to 10 years, where one of the ways in which you respond to Johnny's point is you invoke a command structure, which is kind of like a curious sort of, like that's a paradox, because on the one hand, you're kind of mandating in a quite directive way what needs to happen, but it creates a space then for the kind of very creative things that were happening during the pandemic across Birmingham, across Barking and Dagenham and other places to happen. I think, Johnny, to your, so I think that's the lesson we should take. I don't think anyone's learned it, but I think that's what we should take. To your point, Johnny, I think like the short answer is there just needs to be some very conscious phasing, right? And I think in that sort of first 100 days of an incoming government, and I completely get the difference between kind of practical political narrative like this Ming Vase thing, but that's different to the plan. And in my simple mind, it's like either you go for something like that in the first term, like super fast, but frankly, if that plan's not ready to go, then when will it be? Or maybe you can engineer a kind of crisis moment where you have to go like it's worse than we thought, boom. Or you're very, very cautious. And I do think the kind of 10-year planning horizon is the right one to take because it's going to take a generation to make this happen. And then finally, to your point, Jack, on language, I think love's a great word. And we used to use it all the time in the council. And the example I would give is SEND. Right? So I don't know if there's many parents of SEN children in the room, but if you ask them how their experience is, like the word love is not the one they use, right? It's usually like anger, frustration. And I think that's weird, right? How have we got to a situation where like the most precious person in our lives, our children, and the situation where what's happening if you kind of cut it all back, is that our neighbors, some of whom we know, and strangers that we don't, are all dipping in their pocket to help the most precious person in my life live a better life. And somehow we've not. That should be joyous, right? That is a beautiful, amazing thing. That is what is happening in this society, and yet we have screwed it up so badly that we don't use the word love. We use the word anger, hate, distrust. And like, these are families that are potentially benefiting to the tune of tens of hundreds of thousands of pounds in some cases a year. And so I think, like, if we make almost that a mission, not an emission, it's like within 10 to 15 years, how would we substantially change the experience and the language that parents of SEN children use when they reflect on their engagement with the state? That, I think, would be a very powerful goal. And let's see how we get on with it.
1 minute closing remarks from Mark and Abby. We are at time. Mark, anything else you want to say?
No, it's totally inspiring, and that you just need to read the report, or because it has all of that in it, and that. I mean, I was a speechwriter for a while, so language matters to me more than it probably does to most of the people in the room. But nonetheless, I do think that it begins with talking into being a new world. J.L. Austin, the very famous philosopher, wrote a book called How You Do Things with Words. And the idea was that you perform with words something which then becomes a reality. And we need to talk. That example that was just given is so powerful, because we need to talk about our mutual obligations, the respect we have for each other, our natural humility. And we need to talk about our love and our compassion and our solidarity. And we don't just need to do that in our sort of hobby groups or private lives. We need to do it in Westminster and Whitehall. And that's the primary driver for the kind of transformation that we have looked for tonight. It's not the technical solution. It doesn't get you the policy outcomes, but it begins a conversation within which we can all play our part.
Anything final from you?
Very final on slightly large scale, which is that it's a difference between the scientific method and theology, the things we've been talking about. So the scientific method is observation, theorizing, critical review, and re-theorizing. And that's what you're doing here. And Thomas Kuhn, in his theory of scientific revolutions, talked about science as problem solving, a greater capacity to solve problems, not the greater capacity to approach verisimilitude, the truth with a capital T, because that's not humanly possible, particularly in the social sciences, because there are no natural laws. We change our minds. Gravity doesn't change its mind. The social sciences have very specific constraints. So what Chris is doing is returning us to the scientific method. It's problem solving and constantly reviewing how you do it with the collective intelligence of the teams that you have. What we've been doing for the last 45 years is trying to implement a secular theology, which is an argument from axiomatic deduction about a perfectly efficient economy that you can depict mathematically and formally. And then we've tried to turn that into a set of procedures. And in doing so, we mirrored the other materialist utopia of the 20th century. It's the 21st century. We should break out, I think.
Seems a good, isn't it? Thank you so much. Thank you.
Oh, it's such a brilliant piece of work. Brilliant. Are you going to do a tour of talks elsewhere on it? It's definitely energizing.
I get a quick picture of you.
That was great. I loved it. I have to go and buy the book.
Likewise. I agreed with all your. I was like, yes, that is really all of those.
Oh, so good.
Especially the techno options.